Hello, very good evening to everybody. Wow, what a packed house we have tonight. All of you obviously have a very serious interest in all of this. Welcome to the George Bradshaw address, which we'll hear in just a couple of moments. To let you know, I'm Louise Minchin, formerly of the BBC, now not of the BBC. More on that, not later, by the way. But it's wonderful to be here tonight and to be able to chair the event. Just to let you know a little bit about what's going to happen, we're going to hear from the Secretary of State. I've got a wonderful panel with me here on my left. We'll have a few thoughts from them, and then it's very much going to be open to all of you. There will be time for questions. We have a roving mic. I know where the journalists are. Hello, good evening. So I know where you are. But we will hopefully get a good discussion, but do feel free to ask those questions. I do have an interest. I am a regular rail passenger. If anybody can share my pain, I come from Chester often to London. Anybody here from Avanti? Love to talk to you later. But anyway, my point really is that many of us here are passengers, many of us care, and I bring that perspective tonight more than anything else. Enjoy it. I think it's going to be really informative, but let's hear first of all from Andy Bagnall, who's Chief Executive of Rail Partners. Thank you very much indeed for inviting Andy as well. Thank you.
So, good evening everybody, and welcome on behalf of Rail Partners and its members to the 2023 George Bradshaw Address. It's really fantastic to see so many people in the room and watching online for the first of these events since the pandemic. And I hope you'll agree that we're back with a bang. We have had absolutely unprecedented interest in this year's event, so apologies to those watching online that we couldn't accommodate everybody in the hall. And I have absolutely no doubt that interest is a direct result of the draw of our keynote speaker, the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper. So Mark, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I think, though, the interest in tonight's event also speaks to where the industry finds itself right now. It's seeking direction and clarity of intent on the implementation of reform. Keith Williams, who's with us tonight, his initial report was commissioned way back in September 2018. And since then, there's been a pandemic, a white paper, several changes of personnel at Great Minster House, and the railway has seen a prolonged period of industrial action. So we're probably in this room all too aware of the issues and the challenges that we face. But I know that in this room we also bring together hundreds of years of experience and an unwavering belief in what the railway can, with the right framework, deliver for the country. So I'm really confident that what we'll hear tonight from the Secretary of State is a clear statement of intent that the industry can coalesce around in order to deliver in the interests of both customers and the taxpayer. I think that despite how it sometimes appears, there's actually a lot of consensus across the sector and a shared will to make reform work. It's no secret that elements of previous thinking have been of concern to train operators, particularly around an overly centralised Great British Railways. But the recent collaboration between Rail Partners and the GBR transition team went a long way to allay those concerns. It demonstrated, I think, that all parties want to get on with it, with delivering better outcomes and securing a vibrant future for the railway. So what do we need to make that a reality? From our perspective, first, a streamlined GBR as an arm's-length body that sets the strategy, aligns the incentives, holds to account the infrastructure manager and operators equally. Now, ultimately, that requires legislation, which will itself give a clear focal point for industry reform. Secondly, we'd like to see operators empowered to attract customers back to the railway and, in turn, drive up revenue, reducing the need for subsidy and reducing pressure on already stretched public finances. Revenue and costs need to be brought back together within government to enable a holistic approach to responding to the financial challenges we face. Thirdly, and we've seen something of this in the news over the weekend, the industry's been calling for fares reform for nearly 5 years. And those newspaper reports do suggest that we're on the cusp of a breakthrough. And then finally, we need to be ambitious about growing our freight market, which is why we believe the government should commit to a target of trebling rail freight by 2050. Getting reform right isn't about the railway for its own sake. It's about creating the conditions within which the railway can once again thrive for the good of our customers, our people, the environment and the wider economy. So with all of that in mind, I'd like to introduce the Right Honourable Mark Harper MP. He's been the Member of Parliament for the Forest of Dean since 2005, held a variety of ministerial posts during David Cameron's premiership, and was appointed the Secretary of State for Transport by Rishi Sunak as he became Prime Minister late last year. Secretary of State, over to you to deliver the 2023 George Bradshaw Address. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to Andy and his team at Rail Partners for organising this event and for inviting me to deliver what is my first rail speech since becoming Transport Secretary. Now, what a fantastic setting this is, surrounded by reminders of Britain's glorious engineering history, and Bradshaw, in whose name we meet today, whose timetables brought order to the chaos of the Victorian network. He's as much a part of rail's story as Stevenson, Brunel and others honoured throughout this building. I would also like to pay tribute to Adrian Shooter, who sadly passed away in December. Over the past 30 years, few have played a bigger role in the growth and modernisation of the railways, and I'm sure he's missed by many a friend and colleague here today. Now, I realise I'm the second Transport Secretary to give this prestigious address, and I'm very pleased to see Patrick in his seat. But me and Lord McLaughlin, or Patrick as we know him, or indeed when I first met him, Chief, as he was my Chief Whip for a very considerable period of time, we have a bit more in common. We both hail from working class backgrounds. My dad a labourer, he's a coal miner. We both grew up in historic railway towns, Swindon in my case, Stafford in his, and we were both promoted from the Whip's office to running the Department for Transport. Although he was a bit more of a fast mover than me, I spent a 6-year interlude on the backbenches before I became the Transport Secretary. Now, 6 years may not seem like a very long time, but as Andy said, we did have a lot going on. We left the European Union. We had a global pandemic. We went into it, we emerged from it. We had 2 general elections. And my party may have had just 1 or 2 changes in leadership over that period. But the more things have changed outside the railways, the more they seem to have stayed the same inside. Patrick's 2016 Bradshaw Address was a passionate call for a more flexible, more accountable, more joined up railway. That still rings true today, as do the reflections of previous Bradshaw speakers. Lord Hendy's case for a whole system railway in 2018. Keith Williams a year later with his relentless and right focus on passengers, and even Rick Haythornthwaite's warning at the inaugural Bradshaw Address in 2011 of a disillusioned public not trusting the way our railways are run. Those all sound eerily familiar. So I've spent my first few months in this job listening to the experts, indeed to many people in this room, drawing on my experience in government and years in business to understand what's holding back meaningful change and how we move forward. Now, there's clearly a lot of frustration in the industry. There's a widespread desire to end the sense of drift by moving on from re-diagnosing the industry's ills to getting on with fixing them. And the government's policy is clear. The plan for rail has already been announced to the House of Commons in May 2021. So delivering that policy, moving from the words to action, that is my priority. Because the railways, quite frankly, aren't fit for purpose at the moment. We have them mired in industrial action, which lets down passengers and freight customers. They're historically unable to deliver major improvements at good value for the taxpayer. We have to do both parts of that, the improvements and good value for the taxpayer. And we need a modern railway that meets the needs of the moment. So one reliable enough to be a 7-day-a-week engine for growth that businesses expect, nimble enough for post-pandemic travel while allowing more flexibility for freight, and efficient enough when public spending is rightly scrutinised like never before. The railways need fundamental reform and that is what we will deliver. And so what I'm going to try and set out this evening is how we re-energise that process, freeing reform from the sidings and getting it back onto the main line. Now, first of all, let me provide some context. In putting an end to last year's unwelcome economic and political turbulence, this government promised to be straight with the public about the difficult choices ahead. We set out a plan to restore economic stability, and that plan is working. We've seen a very significant settling of the markets and public confidence since last autumn. We reassured investors, calmed the markets, and strengthened the currency. And that's a strong base from which to deliver the Prime Minister's 2023 economic priorities: halving inflation, growing the economy, and reducing debt. And it's testament to this industry's huge economic potential. Even amidst a challenging fiscal climate, we gave full backing to the £96 billion integrated rail plan. It's the largest single investment ever made in our railways. We're taking HS2 from Euston to Manchester, Northern Powerhouse Rail across the Pennines, and East-West Rail between Oxford and Cambridge. And that had the Chancellor's full support. And we're not wasting any time. In December, I saw the huge construction effort underway at the site of the Curzon Street station in Birmingham. That will be the first new intercity terminus built since the 19th century, attracting tens of thousands of jobs and sparking housing and commercial regeneration across the city. And if you don't have to take my word for it, go and talk to Andy Street, and you'll get a very passionate case about the transformation that HS2 is bringing to his city. But we risk wasting that future infrastructure spending if our railway model is stuck in the past. And thanks to Keith's painstaking work, we know what the underlying issues are. It's the fragmented structure that quickly forgets the customer. It's decision-making with too little accountability, but with too much centralisation, and a private sector rightly criticised for poor performance, but with too few levers to change it. It's an industry in no man's land, as Andrew Haynes correctly described it in his Beazley lecture, and in the end, it's rail's customers that suffer. Like on the East Coast Main Line, where passengers still await the full benefits of billions of pounds in taxpayer investment and years of infrastructure upgrades. And I know this firsthand. As a backbench MP, when I was trying to get a Sunday train from my constituency to London, I remember constantly refreshing the first Great Western timetable to find half the trains weren't running. And so, like many passengers, I often gave up and took the car instead. And Andrew, who was then running First Group, probably remembers my rather irate emails, either from the platform or from the train, interrogating him about why the service was so unreliable. 4 months into this job, I now know why. So I possibly owe him an overdue apology. It wasn't entirely his fault. Because Sunday services are essentially dependent on drivers volunteering to work overtime, which means despite our best efforts, we can't run a reliable 7-day-a-week railway on which customers can depend. So it's why I and the Rail Minister, Hugh Merriman, have been clear throughout the period of industrial action that modernising working practices must be part of reform. It's a pay and reform package that we have to deliver. Finally, the pandemic made a bad problem worse, a lot worse. Thanks to hybrid working, an economic model dependent on 5-day commuting is out of date. Take season ticket sales. They're at just 28% of pre-COVID levels. Unsurprisingly, and you don't need a chartered accountant like me to tell you this, the impact on the industry's bottom line has been stark. Revenue is around between £125 and £175 million lower each month, and costs keep rising year on year. Any other industry would have collapsed years ago. The railways have only survived because of the taxpayer, the source of over 70% of income over the past 2 years, at a cost of £1,000 per household. And I won't mince my words. Operating the railways is currently financially unsustainable. And it isn't fair to continue asking taxpayers to foot the bill. Most of them don't regularly use the railways, including plenty of my constituents in the Forest of Dean. But they find themselves subsidising an industry that delivers only between 1.5% and 2% of all journeys that are taken by the public. That disproportionately serves commuters in the southeast, and whose funding often comes at the expense of other vital transport upgrades at a time when sacrifices are being made across the economy. And we've got to be aware of the trade-offs when it comes to public spending and remind ourselves, as Patrick rightly said in his address, the Department for Transport isn't the Department for the Railways. So we've got a broken model, unable to adapt to customer needs and financially unsustainable. Left untreated, will drive passengers away with poor performance that will lead to fewer services, which will drive more passengers away, and so on and so on. So we're only going to break that cycle of decline with major reform. And Keith's blueprint is the right place to start. So we will create a more customer-focused and joined-up railway, but we want to go further, I want to go further, and actually enhance the role of the private sector, not just in running services, but in maximising competition, innovation and revenue growth right across the industry, which are benefits the private sector has delivered time and again. But let me start with customers. To raise revenue, we've got to instill a customer-first culture. So that means reliable services, comfortable journeys, and accessible stations. But it also means tackling the issue which tops passengers' list of biggest concerns, which is fares and ticketing. With 55 million different fares available, how can anyone feel confident that they're getting the best value for money? Ticketing should be hassle-free, something you barely have to think about, which is why today I can confirm the extension of pay-as-you-go ticketing, with 52 stations across the southeast set to be completed this year, including on Chiltern, London North Western and C2C services. Ticket prices should also be fairer. There's often little difference between the cost of a single or a return. Operators are often unable to significantly reduce prices on quieter services. So after LNER's successful single-leg pricing trial, we're going to extend it to other parts of the LNER network from the spring, and then we'll carefully consider the results of those trials before we extend it more widely. But it means a flexible single fare will always be half the cost of the equivalent return, giving passengers more flexibility and better value. It's not about increasing fares. I want passengers to benefit from simpler ticketing that meets their needs. We're also going to learn from the aviation sector and better manage capacity as well as raise revenue by trialling demand-based pricing on some of those LNER services as well. But passengers are not the industry's only customers. Carrying tens of billions of pounds worth of goods, we cannot overstate rail freight untapped potential for green growth. So I intend to create a duty to ensure the new industry structure realises that potential with a dedicated strategic freight unit tasked with creating better safeguards, more national coordination, and later this year, just listening to what was said earlier, setting a long-term freight growth target. Now, turning towards customers requires us to turn away from the current industry structure. So we will establish Great British Railways, or GBR. And as we prepare for that, we'll pick up the pace of reform. And I am pleased to announce that the winner of the GBR HQ competition will be revealed before Easter. And by the summer, we will respond to the consultation on GBR's legislative powers. The industry has long called for a guiding mind to coordinate the network, so GBR will be responsible for track and train, as well as revenue and cost, which means treating the railway as the whole system it should be, rather than the web of disparate interests that it's become. Passengers won't any longer face the excuse-making and blame-shifting of years past. GBR will be wholeheartedly customer-focused, serving as the single point of accountability for the performance of the railway. And crucially, following ministerial direction, the GBR transition team will develop the guiding long-term strategy for rail, which we will publish later this year, and I hope will provide strategic direction to the whole sector. But there remains a lot of misinformation about GBR, so let me just tackle some of those myths head on. It's not going to be Network Rail 2.0, and it's not going to be a return to British Rail. Taking politics out of the railways is the only way to build a truly commercially led industry, and for me that's non-negotiable. So that's why GBR will be an arm's length body, ensuring a balanced approach to both infrastructure and operations, with both sides getting a seat at the table and both sides delivering an efficient, high-performing railway for customers. Now, the role of ministers is to provide strategic direction and be accountable to Parliament. It is not the role of ministers to pore over operational decisions. I shouldn't need to approve whether a passenger train ought to be removed from the timetable to allow a freight train to run instead, as I was doing earlier today. That will be left to industry experts in 5 regional GBR divisions, working in partnership with regional bodies such as the Greater Manchester and the West Midlands Combined Authorities. I also want to make absolutely clear that our pragmatic reforms stand in stark contrast to Labour's ideological policy of nationalising the railways, cheered on by the rail unions. Nationalisation was tried and ultimately thrown out, and it was largely responsible for the steady decline of passengers and services. It was about as dynamic and forward-looking as the British Rail sandwich. Soggy, wrapped in cling film of backward thinking and unfit for consumption in the 21st century. Now, it simply serves as a trite soundbite for Labour politicians without a clear plan to improve our railways, but with their union paymasters to appease. They want to spend billions of pounds of taxpayers' money buying out the private sector, which would only, in my view, serve to entrench the systemic problems of the railway and do nothing to improve performance for passengers. That's what's important. But we can't take the other extreme view either. Public oversight of our critical infrastructure is needed, especially to support those passenger services that don't turn a profit, but do have an important economic and social role. That's why what we need is a pragmatic partnership between the state and the industry. The dynamism, the innovation and the efficiency of the private sector, the integrated model works, not just with the railways. That's how, for example, we achieved the quickest and most successful COVID vaccine rollout in the world. We used the strategic oversight of the state and the dynamic delivery of the private sector. And that's exactly what we need to do in the railways. It's the only responsible and fair way to fix the broken model. Which brings me to the final area of reform, to enhance the role of the private sector, which I see as central to the future of the railways. Now, under privatisation, thanks to a resilient and world-class supply chain, passenger numbers doubled to 1.75 billion by the eve of the pandemic. Private sector investment in rolling stock reached nearly £7 billion over the past 10 years. Now, I don't want to turn my back on that commercial expertise. The national rail contracts and the current over-centralised approach are temporary. They're a short-term fix, help steer the industry through the pandemic, and we want to phase them out. I want the private sector to play its most important role in our railways. Yet, I want the private sector to help reinvigorate the sector, drive innovation, and the most important thing is attract more customers to the railway. It will do so in partnership with GBR. GBR will help set the right commercial conditions across several key areas. There'll be new passenger service contracts which will balance the right performance incentives with simple commercially driven targets. But they won't be a one-size-fits-all approach. In the past, we know some operators took on more financial risk than they could handle. So that risk will sit where it is best managed. And that includes with operators, but only where it drives the best outcomes for passengers and taxpayers. We shouldn't be afraid to let managing directors of train operating companies actually manage and direct their operations, which is not what they're able to do at the moment. We also want to open up railway data and systems and lower barriers to entry for the industry. So for ticketing, that means a more competitive retail market, and we will welcome new players to spur more innovation and give passengers the services they need. We will expand commercial opportunities around land and property near stations. In Japan, rail companies take full advantage of these investments, generating even more income for the railways, and we should look to do the same. And finally, we will support more open access services where it benefits passengers and taxpayers. We've seen this work well with Hull Trains and Grand Central, as well as with Lumo on the East Coast Main Line, all offering passengers greater choice and more direct links. Open access operators will play an important role in the industry's future, especially as we grow new markets and make the best use of spare capacity on the network. Now let me finish by saying that despite being the second Transport Secretary to deliver this address, I'm probably the first to be given, I understand, a biblical nickname. Modern Railways magazine has described the rail industry as waiting for Moses Harper to come back from the mountain with tablets of stone. Now, well, of course, I'm flattered by that comparison. Unlike Moses, I do plan to live long enough to reach the promised land of rail reform. And whilst my words this evening have not been divinely inspired, they do have the full support of both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, which in politics is the next best thing. So, as a whole government, we are pressing go on rail reform. Day-to-day work will be ably led by the Rail Minister, Hugh Merriman, who's here tonight and has long championed the need for a reformed railway, including when he was chairman of the Transport Select Committee and championed it very ably. He will provide the stability and leadership needed whilst giving the industry freedom to deliver meaningful change. And part of the reason for giving this speech tonight is that I hope you will all rise to the challenge to put customers first, to realise the benefits of GBR, to help enhance the role of the private sector, because only then can the railway earn the public trust it needs to grow. So as we look ahead to the industry's 200-year anniversary in 2025, this is our chance to resurrect some national pride in our railways, a chance to harness the political will that is there, the economic imperative, and, I believe, the industry buy-in to build the modern railway that Britain deserves. It's a chance we cannot afford to waste. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I think there's quite a lot to digest there. And we'll talk to the panel first of all, and then I said questions to everybody as well. So, Steve Montgomery, we've got Chair of Rail Partners, the Rail Delivery Group, and MD of First Rail. I'll come to you in a minute, but first of all, I'll introduce everybody else as well. I'm sure many of you know who's here, but just in case you don't. John Smith, Chief Executive Officer for GB Rail Freight. Good evening to you. Mary Grant, CEO of Porterbrook. Thank you, Mary. Andrew Haynes, aforementioned, Chief Executive of Network Rail and Great British Railways Transition Team. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for joining us. I know you're all sort of personally very invested in discussing all of this. So, Steve, just having heard that, what are your first thoughts?
Well, firstly, Secretary, say thank you very much for coming along to Rail Partners tonight. I think we were all looking to see what you were going to announce, and I don't think you've disappointed is the main thing. I think the encouraging thing is that you recognise that the industry's got to move forward, and I think we all believe that we've sat in this hiatus for a long period of time, from Keith starting his report, and we've sat through the pandemic and the challenges. I think tonight you gave a bit of insight of how we can move that forward, and I think the key thing certainly from the private sector is that recognition that we can play this part in regrowing the railways again. I think it's been something that we've lost over the last couple of years. The innovation's dropped out the industry, and we really need to re-engage that and bring that back in. So it's really important, some of the things that you've announced tonight. I think in GBR, what we would want to encourage and take forward is making sure that we move it through reasonably, as quickly and sensibly as we can, having legislation, trying to get that through so that we can start to build and make something more solid in the foundations. But I think, tonight you've obviously laid out that vision and where you're trying to take it through. Again, I think putting the customer back at the heart of the industry is something that we've lost over the last couple of years again, through the fact that the industry's been trying to reshape itself, trying to understand where we're going. So looking and doing simple things like single leg pricing, the customer starts to see we care about them again. So really important for us. But I think it's, again, we welcome what you've said tonight, and I'm quite sure my colleagues will say a few more things on it. So I'll pass over to John.
Thanks, Steve, and I'll just echo Steve's comments. Secretary of State, thank you for coming this evening, and I think I applaud the clarity that you're starting to offer. We've been in abeyance for 18 months now where things have appeared to be dragging on. I think you're offering us clarity of the direction. I think also it's worth remembering that we're more than able to do this despite the industrial relations issues that are taking place. There's a very vocal minority leading a silent majority astray at the moment. There's good people in this industry who will deliver what you need of them. I'd also applaud the devolvement of power, but I think from a freight perspective, we need that protection of a freight growth target. We need GBR to be incentivised to want us on the network, because when people come back, people on freight trains don't vote, and people on passenger trains do. And we need that protection of GBR having that target. We need them to advocate rail freight. We need them to facilitate what we do. We don't necessarily need them to interfere with our relationship with our customer. We are extremely customer focused. That has not changed ever in the freight industry. And I think some of the growth that's taken place even through the troubled period of COVID, and perhaps that highlighted the importance of rail freight when we were bringing the wine to everyone's table for Christmas. But freight is proof that the private sector works. We have an infrastructure fund owns GB Rail Freight, private sector ownership of the people that we compete with. They want to invest private capital in this industry if they know that the industry can be grown. And what you've described hopefully will help that. So thank you. Mary.
Well, Secretary of State, I'd say refreshingly pragmatic and honest, and rightly so. You said to the audience about the will and the accountability, and the knowledge within this room is here in abundance. These are things that we can all do. Refreshing also that we're not going to go back round a wheel of diagnostics, so we know where our challenges are. I'd say there are more opportunities. We've seen a 2 billion deficit in this industry before, and it's been hugely successful. We talked about the investment commitment of late, but in the last decade there's been over 120 billion of investment committed by government. And so to go backwards and to look at the immediate term is not the way out of this through growth, notwithstanding the huge challenges that we have an immediate reflection to consider and to get out of, bringing that guiding mind, bringing that accountability, asking managing directors to manage, which will bring and maintain and retain the talent in the sector, which is very important from a skills perspective, is absolutely critical. And as somebody in an organisation such as Porterbrook that sits in the very centre of private investment, very refreshing to hear the view of wanting to encourage that, but recognising your other reflection of this has to be a strategically integrated plan, and we should typically look at things over much longer horizons, 30 years, and also being cognisant of value. And you've stressed that it's unsustainable where we are today, but with the might and with the sense and some immediate changes, particularly, and Andy made the comment earlier about costs and revenues, we can see that and yield and initiatives and innovation come back and drive that customer. We are here at the end of the day to grow customer volumes. So I commend that support for the private sector, but also I'm very cognisant of value. And I think we also have to support that collaboration and partnership and demonstrate that value, not just a right to be part of, for the next 25 plus years within this industry, which has had some fantastic successes and the growth that you've already mentioned since privatisation. So I think we've got a strong story ahead of us, like Steve has just said, but we do need to get on with it as well and give some guidance and structure back to the industry. Thank you.
Andrew, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. In one sense, a deep sigh of relief, I think, in a lot of people probably, to know that we weren't about to rip it up and start again. And thank you for the apology as well, witnessed by hundreds of people. I mean, it's not often.
Did you keep the emails?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Did you keep the emails?
I have them imprinted in my ear for the conversation. But the thing I found heartening is I maybe I'm wrong, but I picked up four key themes really from what you said. One is that drive to be customer-centric. And that's going to be so key to what we do and now, and let's not wait till after legislation to do that. That would be wrong for the country, it'd be wrong for users, and would be wrong politically. And I think that sense of leadership that you offered is going to be really important in driving that through, and Hugh's readiness to pick up that baton to make real progress in the short term. I like the recognition of devolution, both in terms of not creating this big fat controller, but really accountable regional divisions that will work with Metro Mayors. I think that's so important because, I think that seems to be the general direction of politics in the country generally, without preempting, future government announcements. And therefore a railway that doesn't recognise that is a railway which I think is in denial of the realities, and I think there's more that we can do in that sense. The focus on a guide in mind that does big decisions but doesn't micromanage. I think our industry is cursed with micromanagement at the moment, and the idea of the super fat controller sucking decisions in is profoundly wrong, but equally there are some big ticket issues. If we're going to make the most of HS2, NPR, transparent route upgrade, there will need to be some direction. So that clear distinction between direction and micromanagement. And the last, on diversity, the diversity of the model, the fact that it will be different in different places and different times. There'll be times when, then revenue risk, as you said, will be the right thing for people, and there'll be times where it's simply not practical because of all the change. And I suppose something which wasn't touched on, but I reflect on the other side of diversity in terms of people. You're the anomaly on this panel in not having worked in first group at the same time. The four of us, by coincidence. You were the poor customer, as it happens, isn't it? These two worked for me, and Steve worked for me, which is brilliant. It shows the strength of the team, but it also shows that we're in need of new blood in our system. And I think what I find really exciting about clarity of purpose is that we can attract new blood and new energy. At the moment, if we're in stasis, it's very hard to go out there and recruit talent that says, come to this vigorous, dynamic, commercial, can-do, purpose-driven railway. And I think what you offer is a real opportunity for us to work together on making that pitch. So thank you.
I'll just open to the floor in a minute. Just a couple of things I wanted to pick up, if I could, with you, Secretary of State. It's come up a couple of times, and you mentioned it, legislation. So how much of this needs legislation, and how long will that take?
So two things. So some of it does need legislation, and you've been doing this long enough to know that it's not within my gift personally to promise it. But I think what I would say on legislation is repeat what I just said in the speech, which is what I said in the speech and our reform agenda has the full support of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and they are the people that make these decisions. So I think people should just note that point and file it away. On the Andrew's point, though, we're not going to wait for that, because actually legislation in the full session, doesn't become law to the back end of next year. That's too long. Hugh and I want to get on with this, so we want to start making decisions and pulling things together, start joining up the P&L, it's a chartered accountant, I'm afraid, can't resist, but pulling together the P&L, making sensible decisions on infrastructure and operations, and starting to bring that together as soon as we can. And that's why we're rolling out that pay-as-you-go ticketing. We're going to start looking at expanding the single leg pricing. We want to try and start delivering improvements that customers will notice. It won't be overnight. No one's going to wake up one day and go, there's a transformed railway. But over the next couple of years, people will see incrementally improvements in the passenger experience and also the freight customer. So that's why customers is the right language, because it means passengers and freight customers, but we want people to start noticing an improvement.
That was going to be my question, actually. When would passengers and other customers start noticing things, but you think this will happen soon? Just on that pricing thing, how do you make sure that it's not a way to make passengers pay more?
Well, look, I think, to be quite honest, the purpose of this exercise, there's two ways we can go with the fact that this industry is currently financially unsustainable. Either we don't get any new passengers and we don't get any more revenue, and then frankly, a government is going to start cutting services, because putting the level of subsidy at the moment, when only 2% of people's journeys are by rail, which is why Patrick's warning about the Department for Transport, not the Department for Trains. Most people's journeys are by car, walking, and the public transport mode that people use a lot more than trains are buses. And that's not what the Department for Transport spends most of its time doing. The public isn't going to continue putting the money into the sector. So the only way that you have a thriving, sustainable, growing railway is to get more passengers using it and driving up the revenue. And passengers are not going to be attracted to the railway if they think it's a rip-off. So it's about innovation. It's about filling up the trains when they're not as busy. It's about getting the revenue from the journeys people want to make. One of the positive things we've seen actually post-pandemic is leisure travel has actually rebounded very strongly. It's commuter traffic and business travel that hasn't, which is why revenue is 20% down. Leisure travel is a very good example. When people get a good offer, they want to use the trains. So it's about a good, attractive offer to passengers, and passengers feeling like they're getting a good deal, and then we'll drive up numbers and revenue, and the industry in a much better place.
Steve, can I put a question to you before we go, which is, I know that you're very much involved in having conversations about industrial relations. How does this conversation get reflected in those, do you think?
I think
is that a fair question?
I think it's a fair question in terms of that. The Secretary said it's laid out the vision for the industry. We need all parties to work to drive the industry forward. The trade unions are part of that industry. They have got to work with us. We've got to work with the trade unions to try and deliver this ultimately for the customer. If we don't deliver for the customer, then there's no industry. So the trade unions become irrelevant like the rest of us. So it's really getting them on board and making sure that they understand this and how can we grow the industry back up again. We've done it over the years. We've been very successful in the UK in growing the industry over the last 25 years. And the trade unions benefited a lot from that. So we need them to come back in and work with us again, and we can kick on again. But it takes both sides.
Well, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so look, I just reiterate that. Look, I'll say what I said to the General Secretaries. Look, when I took over this job, I tried to change the tone of the conversation we were having with the trade unions. The dispute had been going on for quite a long time. So I met all of them with Hugh. Hugh's been having regular meetings with them to facilitate that dialogue between the trade unions and the employers, both Network Rail and the train operating companies. And I'll say what I said to them. There are two choices. I want, for their members, we need a thriving rail industry that attracts more customers, grows revenue, expands services, and continues to see the fantastic investment we're seeing both on improving the existing network, investing in new network, and doing things like HS2, which is going to change the economic geography of the country and do on its route what we're going to see the Elizabeth line already doing, which has already reached 100 million passengers. And that was, if you remember, that was a line where, yes, there were lots of difficulties in delivering it, there were budgetary challenges, but now it's open and being used by those 100 million passengers. Nobody would go, oh, glad we, we shouldn't have done that. George Osborne, to give him credit, faced a quite strategic choice when he became Chancellor in 2010. He was faced with the decision about whether he should axe Crossrail or not. He could have saved the money at a very difficult time when we were balancing the books. Nobody today would thank him if that's the decision he made. He made the decision to have a bit of vision, a bit of long-term sense about what was important, made that decision, and that's why we have the fantastic Elizabeth line now, which is going to transform the economic geography of those communities. That's what HS2 is going to do, and that's why the Chancellor confirmed that the government's committed to delivering it from Euston to Manchester.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the industrial relations.
After you, it's...
Please, me first.
Sorry, go on.
No, after you. I meant after you.
No, I just wanted to pick up
Let's make a brief comment.
Secretary of State on the industrial relations issues. You know, one of the problems the industry has faced is the constant change, particularly in the franchising process. And taking Andrew's point, the leadership then that's within that. You know, the great thing about rail freight and what we've achieved is that people feel allied to the business that employs them. They know the rights and the wrongs of the economic model can be argued, but they know we have the bottom line and that they can contribute to that. And consequently, if they see steady, strong leadership, and if we can attract those people to the industry, which to a certain extent we've been struggling to do more recently, I think it's easy to actually change the cultures of what's taking place out there. And we do have Sunday in the working week.
Not a similar point to John, which is the fact that we have the industrial relations we have is not an accident. It's a predictable consequence of the incentives the system currently has. Network Rail, train operators, to make short-term trade-offs all the time. And what we've done is we've been feeding a system that says it's better to keep people quiet and not deal with the fundamental issues. And until we create incentives for people to do that, where they're rewarded for taking tough decisions in the long-term interest, we will repeat that culture and that behaviour. That's why this is an inflection point for industrial relations as well. People and the workforce will respond to that. When they know the rules have changed, they will respond to it. But they've been used to a pattern of behaviour where everybody's acted rationally, but not in the long-term interests.
Just very briefly, the final point on that. Look, we worked really hard when we came into post. We did what we were asked to do by the trade union leaders. We went off and we got the ability for the employers to make an improved offer, both from the train operating companies and Network Rail. That is a best and final offer that's on the table. And I very much hope that the people working in the industry are going to get the opportunity to vote on it and then make a decision about the future. I think there's a very positive future for the rail industry and all of the people that work in it. But we're only going to get there if people kind of go on the journey together. And I think there's a real opportunity there, and I hope people take it.
Okay, so thank you very much indeed. It is open to you. We've got microphones, so make yourselves known to me, and then we'll... Do you want to take... There was actually someone here was first, in the middle here. Okay. And... Oh. There you go, you've got the microphone. I will come to you. Do you want to say who you are and where you're from and who you want to answer?
Thank you very much. Anthony Smith from Transport Focus. Secretary of State, a very welcome sense of pace and direction of change. How would you articulate that for passengers catching a train today who want reliability above all else? And in some parts of the country that has been lacking recently. Thank you.
Well, look, that is the right question because, you know, I get a lot of feedback. I mean, for some of you that don't realise, one of the big differences between the rail industry and the aviation sector, for example, is when people's trains are late, their response of many passengers, which is not actually entirely wrong, because I do issue the contracts, is they start tweeting me on social media about their specific train problem and want to know what I'm going to do about it. Now, no one does that if their plane is late, right? They think the person who's accountable is... They might tweet the chief executive of the company that runs the aeroplane and hold them accountable. They don't think it's my fault. And at the moment, it's all on me. And that is just mad. The idea that I am deciding how many trains run between two different cities or whether I should get rid of a passenger service to allow I mean, it's just nonsense, right? I was doing that in the car on Saturday, being asked all these decisions. It's just mad. No one would run a business like that. So it's about joining up the decisions we make on infrastructure and on passenger services so that you make sensible decisions. And when you have to take tough decisions to do engineering work at the weekend, you choose the right weekends, you have the right messages to the customers, you put the right services in place to keep the customers able to travel. But you make those decisions in a joined up way. That's not what happens at the moment. What happens is Network Rail do the work, the train operating company say it's Network Rail's fault, and everyone blames each other. And it's terrible. So I think the message to the passengers will be, we want to get a more sensible system that puts them at the heart of it. They're not going to notice overnight it all gets better. And I think people can see that we've got to get the industrial relations sorted out. But if we at least set out, as I hope I have this evening, a direction that is going to lead to a better outcome, and they see incremental improvement, one day they turn up at the station and they get pay as you go, or they then see a new company comes in and has done a new app because we've got open data and there's a much more simplified ticketing system. They see real changes in how they use the railways, then they'll know that things are going in the right direction, and you'll see more people use the rail network, revenue will go back up, and the industry will be in much better shape.
Thank you very much. One there.
Hi, Jack Simpson from The Telegraph. You talked about supporting more open access services onto the network. Where do you see those opportunities and how will you encourage that?
So first of all, the first bit of your question, slightly, and I'm deliberately not going to answer it in the way that I think you want it, because the whole point is it's not me that should be deciding where there should be open access services. The whole point is it should be the operator who spots that there is demand or that they have a commercial offer that they think will be attractive to people, and they sort of beat down GBR's door, not me deciding, sat in Great Minster House, that they should join the industry. That's the whole problem. It shouldn't be me or Hugh deciding where these train services get run. That's what's wrong with the system, I think, at the moment. And at the moment, the incentives are all wrong, because what happens in the department if an open access operator turns up is my officials say to me, oh, I don't think we want to do that because they're going to be taking away the revenue that belongs to the Treasury, actually, at the moment. So we have a mad system where I have all the costs, the Treasury has all the revenue risk, and we're trying really hard to make sensible decisions where you join those two things together, but it's not a sensible model at the moment. So the whole point is I want more open access operators, I want more competition. The ones that exist at the moment deliver great services to passengers and have great customer feedback. But the whole point is it shouldn't be me deciding, it should be sending out a clear message that we want those operators, and people out there will look at the opportunities that are there and will get more people coming to the system or would deliver better services for passengers. That's kind of where we want to get to.
Okay, so there's a couple at the back over there. Are you okay?
Good evening. I'm Graham Cross from MTR. We run the Elizabeth line. Thank you, Secretary of State, for mentioning Adrian Shooter in your introduction. When I worked for him at Chiltern Railways for many years, he would say to me, if you have an idea for spending £1 that earns £2 in revenue, don't ask my permission, don't ask the Secretary of State's permission, just do it. And we did do it, and we grew passenger numbers and customer satisfaction to significantly higher levels than they were at before we arrived. We urgently need to get back to that for many of the reasons that you've said, so that we can reduce the burden that the railway is placing on taxpayers and grow customer numbers back to where they should be, which I think is much higher than where they were before the pandemic. But what I want to ask is when are you going to allow us to do that? It doesn't need legislation.
No, look, a very good question. I mean, look, the reason why I mentioned Adrian was because having come into this job, it was very clear to me from what people said that he made a real difference on the various businesses he was connected with in growing this industry, which is why I thought it important to recognise that. And you make a very good point in what you say. At the moment, we are presented with decisions where I get asked to make decisions which are going to save costs which my department faces, but which then deprive the Treasury of more revenue. And I keep having to push back and go, no, that doesn't make any sense at all. And then I have sensible conversations with the Treasury about trying to look at the whole P&L of the industry. And I said, the good news for you to be aware of is, you know, the Chancellor takes a real interest in this. And when I say a real interest, I don't mean in the bad sense of the word. The Chancellor's paying very close attention to the money. He actually does care about the railway. And when he was asked the other week about HS2, he was very clear that he was very enthusiastic that we had spades in the ground and we were committed to build that railway. And he said in the autumn statement, you know, which was a difficult statement for him, he had to make lots of tough calls. You'll remember he absolutely reiterated the government's support for HS2 and for East West Rail and for the integrated rail plan. So, and all the stuff we've promised in the north of England. So that's very clear. So I want to try and, I'm not going to give you a specific date and then miss it, but Hugh and I want to start delivering some of this stuff urgently and then working with the Treasury to make sensible, joined-up decisions in government that do exactly that. If you come to me with an idea and you're going to deliver me £2 of revenue and it's only going to have £1 of cost, then I'll bite your hand off and let you do it. But most importantly, you shouldn't be having to come and ask me. I should set up a system so you'll just go off and do it and deliver the bottom line. That's where we want to get to. And you're right, that doesn't need legislation to do that, which is why we want to get on and do it. And part of the point of the remarks this evening was to say, that's the direction of travel. We've got the Prime Minister and the Chancellor's support, and we're going to get on with it.
I know there's a couple of questions in here, but you've been very patient. Have we got a microphone down here? We'll come back to you up here as well.
Thanks, Louise. Nigel Harris, Rail Magazine. You and I talked on Thursday, Secretary of State, and in advance of that meeting, I talked to a lot of managing directors, principally in the train operating community, and I know they will be punching the air at your expression about, you know, managing directors ought to be able to both manage and direct. Now, you don't need a bit of legislation to do more of that. You and Hugh could start tomorrow on winding back and unwinding the layer upon layer of micromanagement, which is stifling the industry. If you want some more details, Steve alongside you, I'm sure, will give you some. But Louise mentioned Avanti. In advance of that meeting with you, I was told that there are 27 DFT officials literally micromanaging every decision that AWC makes. That can't be a sensible way to run anything. And a quick second question again, which I don't think requires any legislation. I think I saw Bill Reeve in the room earlier from Transport Scotland. If you ask Bill how he spells decarbonisation, he will literally spell out the word electrification. You didn't mention anything about that in your speech. You did mention East-West. And again, I don't think you need legislation to decide tomorrow not to build that as a diesel railway. Mary Grant down the far end of the line there, I'm sure stands ready to provide you with really great electric trains, which are cheaper to design, build, maintain, and operate.
Go for the question. Come on.
And well, can we
know what it is.
Can we expect you to do more of that rapidly tomorrow, because that does not require legislation, more electrification, and unwinding the micromanagement?
Yeah, so look, let me pick up the first point. Look, I don't know exactly how many officials we have crawling all over the various bits of the private sector, but you're right, it's far too many, and Hugh and I get every day submissions, he gets more of them than I do, that ask us to make decisions about everything to do with running the rail network, and it's just not sensible. But I'm afraid it's where you get to, A, when the taxpayer's putting in the money, because quite reasonably the Treasury, when it's supplying the cash, expects a lot of control. But the system we've got at the moment doesn't make any sense. Decisions are not made in the right way, you don't join up cost of revenue, and you don't balance the trade-offs. There are lots of trade-offs in running a railway, and I don't need to tell everyone in this room, they all know. But those don't get made properly at the moment. And you're right, a lot of that, we can take steps to do that fast. We wanted to, Hugh already knew lots about trains, I knew less. I wanted to take some time to get my head around it, work out what the model looked like. And the way we want to deliver GBR is, as has been said, sort of a slim controller, not a fat controller, and much more of a role for the private sector than I think had been envisaged in the original plans. I'm very clear, the thing I've learned since I've been doing this job is if we're going to get more passengers and more freight onto the railways, and we're going to drive up revenue, it is not going to be done by civil servants and ministers. It's going to be done by innovation, new ideas, new thinking, and a nimble private sector. And if we don't do that, the railways don't have a future. I want them to have a future, which is why we need to deliver reform.
Okay. Electric trains?
Look, we have delivered a lot of electrification. It's a very specific question there, which I'm happy to take away. But look, we also have a big decarbonisation agenda, and electrification is the way to go. We've delivered a lot of electrification on the network, and I'm sure there'll be lots more to come.
You can have that as a takeaway.
We'll take that as a takeaway.
There was one question here. I will go to you first of all, and then we'll come to that. Here we go.
Hi, Phil Sherwood from Modern Railways, Secretary of State. I'm not sure if I have permission to call you Moses, since you quoted us. Just two questions. You talked about...
Can we have one, please, because we're running out of time, and I want to be on time.
You talked about how you would, if the revenue doesn't come back, you would have to ask train operators to make cuts to services. There were train operating company managing directors in this room who have been tasked by DfT to cut from their budgets, are having to send fleets of trains off lease. So I just want to know how you'd respond to that. And you also made your commitment to the integrated rail plan clear. I just wanted to ask you to comment on the report in the Financial Times this morning about various options, including ditching what's left of the eastern leg altogether. Thank you.
So, on the second point, well, first of all, I generally don't comment on speculation in newspapers. And as we saw at the weekend about the way the single leg pricing was reported, it wasn't entirely accurate. So I don't generally comment on speculation in newspapers. On your on your first point about on your first point, I think we want to get to a model where we join up decisions. It's right at the moment. We do ask train operating companies to come up with ideas to save costs. And one of the things Hugh and I have been pushing back on is decisions that save costs but have a bad effect on revenue are a terrible idea. So we've given very clear direction to our officials. They don't make sense. We've got to look at the whole P&L. You've got to look at revenue and cost, not reducing services if that's going to drive down revenue. So one of the things we're trying to do already is encourage, and one of the things we will do, picking up that question from there, is encourage operators to come forward with ideas on how to drive up revenue. And as long as there's the costs of doing that are less than the revenue you deliver and it's net positive to the P&L, we'll encourage that. Where we want to get to is the better solution, where we set up a set of incentives so that that's what private operators are incentivised to do, and they don't keep having to come and bring those ideas to ministers for ministers to make the decisions. So I think we've already started doing that, because Hugh and I have looked at some ideas that have been put forward to cut costs, but which cut revenues more, and they don't make sense. So we don't do them. And they don't make sense for anybody. They don't make sense for the taxpayer, don't make sense for passengers. We want to grow the revenue, improve the services, and get more passengers back on the railway and grow the revenue. And that's how you get the industry in better shape.
Okay, I'm going to try to go for two more questions because we're running out of time. It is you know who you are, with the glasses.
Yes. Not a question for the Secretary of State, but Ben Clapworthy from the Times, Andrew Haynes and Steve Montgomery. Both the Secretary of State and Hugh Merriman, the Rail Minister, have said that they've changed the narrative with the union since they took over the job. Is that true?
No, it's
yes.
It's absolutely true. It's absolutely true, because they've taken some of the more robust rhetoric out and said, look, we're prepared to talk, we're prepared to meet, but the conversations are equally direct and blunt, but they're done in a measured, considered tone that isn't confrontational, because the underlying realities haven't changed. But what that's allowed us to do is to avoid the distraction. It's a harsh reality that, however well-intentioned, noisy political rhetoric is, if anything, it galvanised the workforce against settling, to be honest, because it was a them and us approach, and it demonised, and I've seen a very material change in the sentiment amongst Network Rail colleagues because the heat has been taken out of that political debate. However well-intentioned, it is bashing people up in the newspapers doesn't work if you want to get people to vote for something. And I think the the way that Mark and Hugh have dealt with that has been a real asset. It's not yet enough to fix it, but it's necessary. It's absolutely necessary, and I think there's been a real dividend from it.
Do you want to add anything to that, Steve?
No, I'd just say I think it's been depersonalised a wee bit, became very much them and us, and I think, you know, the Secretary of State, Hugh, have made it a more sensible discussion, and there's less conflict in the room, less animosity in the room, albeit we're still a bit apart, but I think that's helped the situation.
Thank you very much. There's a question over there.
Neil Syme, Managing Director, Victor Rail Freight. Can I commend you, Secretary of State? I don't think I've ever heard a Secretary of State use the F word so many times in one presentation, and really good to see that freight is very much on your agenda, so thank you. Really just want to come back to the decarbonisation point and the private sector point. Electrification is what we're crying out for in the freight business to help government decarbonise the economy. Transport is a big player in carbon emissions. We know we can do it. I think with the private sector involvement, I would also ask, and I think Andrew as well, we need to challenge perceived wisdom. We need to challenge the obscene costs of not only electrification but other things as well. And whatever you do, we need to incentivise the private sector to be able to challenge, to do the job safely, but be able to get rid of a lot of the bureaucracy that is holding us back from really being able to contribute towards a decarbonised UK.
Yeah, look, that's a very good question. Part of the reason why we're going to have that duty to grow freight is because the vast majority of our freight is carried on the roads, and it doesn't need to be. And there's lots of freight which we can carry on rail, and that's much better for the planet, much less carbon intensive. And so we absolutely want to grow that. Your point about the cost of rail infrastructure, point I frequently make, and point I make about road infrastructure as well. We do need to challenge cost on behalf of the taxpayer. I mean, some of this stuff is difficult, and some of it is, you know, innovative and groundbreaking. I mean, one counter to that view is that my international arm that I have, Crossrail International, which goes out and works with the private sector on trying to get work for British companies around the world. We get loads of people from other countries coming to look at our big projects, which we spend all of our time criticising and saying are terrible and they're over budget and they're dreadful and we should be ashamed of ourselves. Other people from other countries come along and recognise they're difficult to deliver, think they're fantastic, and then want to hire British companies to go and help them deliver their rail stuff at home. And we sometimes don't always recognise that when you're doing tough, difficult, innovative stuff, it is actually quite difficult, and it's not all going to go well. And that's why I use the example of Crossrail, the Elizabeth line, because I remember being a Member of Parliament, all of the different challenges along the way, you know, and there are definitely things that could be done better. Some of the systems integration stuff could have been done better, and we've learned some of those lessons for HS2, but nobody now, seeing that line in action, would thank George Osborne if he'd drawn a line through it and crossed it out and hadn't delivered it. It's a fantastic piece of infrastructure. And the thing that we don't sell very well, and that's for politicians, we don't explain the opportunities that are created by transport infrastructure. You create opportunities and you create things that people can do that you don't know yet that they're going to be able to do. And that line is going to change the economic geography of a huge chunk of the country. When we deliver HS2, it's going to do the same. And as I said, you talk to Andy Street, you meet some of the, and this is Apprenticeships Week, you meet some of the over 1,000 apprentices who are employed by HS2. Not all young people straight out of school, quite a lot of them are people who've done career changes. You talk to them, the passion for the industry, the sense that they're making a real difference to their communities, and they are getting new businesses relocating to Birmingham. It's going to transform the lives of people. That's levelling up in action. The railway has a big part to play in that, and we need to communicate that better to people. And if you do that, they understand why you're spending the money, but they also understand that there's going to be a massive return on investment for that money for the country, and you're going to help deliver our net zero things. And it's like, what's not to like about that? We have to be better and clearer about selling that vision to people, and then I think we'll get people reward us in return.
I know you've had lots of questions, but I have been told I'm allowed to have one more, so I'm going to give it to over here. Go for it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
We are going to be a little bit late.
Thanks, David Churchill from the Daily Mail. On strikes, it's looking like the RMT is likely to reject the current offer to the TOCs and Network Rail. So given you've said that the offer at the moment is the best and final, are we now facing many more months of strikes, do you think? And just to be clear, are you completely ruling out the possibility that you could adjust the mandate again so that the offer can go up perhaps, you know, an extra % to make it a 5+5 pay offer to try and get a deal over the line?
Well, two things on that. On your second point, best and final means what it says. And the fact that the rail reform agenda has the support of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, that's the government's position, not just mine. But look, what I'd say to you is I'm not going to anticipate what they might decide. I'm going to say again what I said to them, to the union leaders, to their faces. I want, for their members, what they need is a growing rail industry that has more passengers and more revenue. Right? That's in their interest. We are going to have reform. We need reform on Network Rail, on how we deliver infrastructure improvements. We've got to drive down the cost of doing that. We've got to make that more efficient. And on the train operating companies, the one I will pick up again is the one I said in my speech. You've got to have a railway that operates 7 days a week, that does not depend on people working on their days off. We want to train more people to drive trains. Part of the franchises where there's a problem is because there aren't enough drivers. And those are things that have got to be fixed. So I hope that the trade union leaders give their members, the people they work for, the chance to reach their own decision on the offer that's been put before them. I think that's the democratic thing to do, and then it'll be up to the workers in those industries to make the decision about their pay and conditions. That's the first thing. But look, this is a partnership. It's what I said in my speech. It's a pragmatic partnership, and that's not just between the government and the train operating companies and Network Rail. It's also the people that work in the industry. It's a fantastic industry, and I want to build it and grow it. And that's for everybody that's involved in it. And I think there's a real opportunity for the trade union leaders, and you know, they have a job to do. They're working on behalf of their members. There's a real opportunity for them to work with us in that spirit of pragmatic partnership to grow this industry. That's the right thing to do for everybody. They've got the chance to do that, and I would very much urge them to take that opportunity and not let it slip through their fingers.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for all your questions. Thank you very much indeed, particularly to you for taking so many questions, Secretary of State. And we are nearly on time, but and what's really clear to me sitting here...
It's a train joke, you could say.
I know there is. I'm just going to leave it because we all know it's in there, don't we? I just want to say, you know, it's been absolutely fascinating. It's hugely informative. And what's really clear in the room and from the panel as well, there is so much passion around what is happening. So that is it's been really something to be part of and to be able to see that. We're going to give them a round of applause in a minute, but actually Andy is going to, obviously, having invited us all here, is going to have a little chat with us, and I just want to say thank you very much indeed from my part for being a brilliant panel. Thank you. Andy.
So I'm just going to close the event just with a couple of quick reflections and some thank yous. First and foremost, can I say thanks again to the Secretary of State for giving us the address tonight, and also to all of the panellists for what I thought, and I hope you'll agree, was a really insightful discussion. So we could give them another round of applause. I really welcome Mark's speech tonight. I think the intent that he set out is going to be absolutely critical to driving the industry forward. I think it was Mary who said in the discussion that we did fear perhaps with the change of political personnel a return to the drawing board, whereas instead, while of course there's still detail to be worked through collectively, I think there seems to me to be a broad alignment with the need to just get on with it, so that's very welcome indeed. On Great British Railways, the Secretary of State said actually that the industry has long been calling for a guiding mind. And again, it feels to me that there's very clear consensus on the need for a new body to give the network greater coherence. And I'm very pleased that it feels that Mark, you and indeed Andrew and the GBR team have landed in exactly the right place in terms of the debate around the size and scale of that body. a strategic body that will take accountability, bring coherence, but ultimately deliver through others rather than micromanaging and trying to take every decision itself. Also felt to me from the address and the discussion afterwards that a refreshed blueprint was laid out this evening for a reformed public-private partnership. Essential that we harness the best of the private sector's commercial expertise, ultimately to deliver for who's really important in this conversation, the customer. And that's both passengers, but also, as the colleague said earlier, the F word, freight customers. And so the promise of the growth target coming later this year is very welcome. I was also particularly pleased to hear the Secretary of State call the current arrangements mad, where Treasury is responsible for revenue and the Department for Transport for cost. As I think it was Graham's question said, we've absolutely got to get back to having operators having the freedom to spend £1 in order to generate £2. And then lastly, in terms of the reflections, I think the fares reform announcements that you've made suggest to me that we have a Secretary of State who's finally been successful in persuading the Treasury to bite the bullet of what will be a complex change programme. So Mark, thanks ever so much again for your time and for your candour, and good luck for the months ahead. I hope what will become obvious to you as we work through delivery is that this is not an industry that's resistant to change, rather one that wants to use its expertise across public and private sectors to help achieve the vision that you've set out. So look, lastly, as you all know, events like this don't just happen. So I must also thank Louise for chairing the evening, Rachel and the rest of the team at Dodds for their support with the logistics, and of course my team at Rail Partners, especially our External Affairs Director Hannah Moxon, for all their effort in making this evening happen. And then one last thank you to all of you, the audience, for coming along and for watching online. Hope to see you next year. Thanks very much.